This week on Q&A, author Miles J. Unger discusses his latest book, Machiavelli, a biography. The book is an exploration of the life and writings of the noted Italian philosopher and playwright.
Miles Unger, I have on my lap here your book called Machiavelli, a biography. Why did you think that there's a market for this at this stage in the world?
Well, I think there's always a market for Machiavelli. Machiavelli is one of the most, of all the Renaissance writers you can think of, I think he's probably the most quoted, the most, more titles with Machiavelli's name in very unusual contexts. Machiavelli for businessmen is very common. How to manage like Machiavelli, Machiavelli for relationships. You name it, Machiavelli's name comes up. He's one of the few men, one of the few names that really comes down and it's come into the common language. And I think there's always a fascination with him, part of it based on a misunderstanding, part of it valid, but he's certainly one of the perennially fascinating characters in history.
What's the misunderstanding?
Well, Machiavelli has become an adjective. I doubt there are very many people in this town who would like to have themselves described as Machiavellian. No matter, I have a feeling that many of them read The Prince secretly, at the dark of night on their, have it next to their bedside. But not too many people would call themselves Machiavellians. They might call themselves pragmatists or realists, but very few people want to be called Machiavellians because he has been associated with a kind of underhanded, cynical, manipulative approach, not only to politics, but to life as well. And I don't think this is really what he was about, but it's a natural misunderstanding and one that goes very early back to really the first years after his death, where he was called an enemy of the human race, the finger of Satan. So there's certainly always a fascination for people who get that kind of reputation.
When did you get interested in him?
That's interesting you asked that because I thought back to this. I was giving a talk shortly after I'd completed the book and it had come out, and I realized I had written a paper when I was in 10th or 11th grade on Machiavelli. And I remember I was living in Florence at the time, and that's my fascination sort of stems from that era. But I remember my fascination with him in particular, had this notion that he was not the man he was purported to be. He was not this villainous character, but rather somebody who was dealing with the sort of the realities as he found them and wanted to find a way to honestly look at human beings the way they were and in my naive way, and I'm sure I wish I had that paper somewhere that I'd written. But it was sort of I have not really changed my ideas on him that much. I'm much more sophisticated, much more knowledgeable, but that idea that he was up to something other than the common perception of what he was up to is something that's always fascinated me.
Why were you living in Florence and that time in your life?
My mother took us to Florence. I went there when I was 11. And had most of my high school years there. My mother, I think she wanted to follow in the footsteps of Henry James and the Brownings, and had a very romantic notion of Florence, and sort of took her 3 kids right after she got divorced. And it was sort of a lark, and for me it was certainly a fascinating, and I fell in love with the city, fell in love with the history, and I've gone back many times since then, and it's just to me, Florence is such a wonderful place to be, and it's just a beautiful, fascinating city, full of sort of both violence and the heights of civilization and the kind of lowest lows of human depravity. And it's just a fascinating era, and you could still see that on the streets of Florence if you look closely.
Where's your home originally?
Well, I moved around a lot. I've sort of an off and on New Yorker. My father was a college professor, and we moved around. I was born in California, but sort of peripatetic. I now make my home in near Boston, but I go back to Florence as often as I can. I still love it.
How many books have you written, and what were the others about?
Well, I wrote, before this book, I got on this Florentine Renaissance vein with my last book. I wrote a book on Lorenzo de' Medici, called Magnifico, and the central figure, the defining figure of the Italian Renaissance, the man who presided over Florence in its golden age. He was known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, and it really captures a kind of splendor and pageantry and the great artistic production of Florence at that time. And writing about Lorenzo and the kind of politics and the kind of machinations and the violence seething just beneath the surface, it was sort of a natural. Machiavelli wrote extensively about Lorenzo de' Medici. Lorenzo de' Medici died when Machiavelli was 23, so he knew him, probably knew him personally, knew his family, knew his sons, and it was certainly, Machiavelli seemed like a natural follow-on from that.
What year was Machiavelli born and where?
He was born in 1469 in the city of Florence, and Florence was one of the 5 major states of Renaissance Italy. Italy was a divided country. It was not even a country. It was divided among 5 major powers and a host of duchies and principalities and petty states. Florence was the weakest of the 5. It was the sort of most centrally located and also probably the weakest. It was weaker than the kingdom of Milan, the Duchy of Milan, of Venice, which had its great maritime empire. You had Naples down at the south, ruled by a Spanish-born family, the Aragonese, and then you had the Papal States, which sort of surround Florence on 3 sides. And it was a very precarious position for Florence. And during Machiavelli's youth, Lorenzo de' Medici was a very adept politician, very adept diplomat, and he managed to keep all these balls sort of in the air, managing to keep Italy at peace and, more importantly, the foreigners out. And with his death really comes the calamity when the foreigners sort of sweep in and sort of cause chaos and destruction.
I noticed in one of your footnotes you said Machiavelli lived to be 88.
No, he lived to be 58.
Well, it's interesting. Maybe it's a misprint that I read.
It could be a misprint. He died in 1527. He died at 58, yeah.
I thought that was
Michelangelo, I think, lived to be 88. But 58 for a man of that era was a average, perhaps above average lifespan. Lorenzo de' Medici, for instance, lived to be 43.
Go through those 58 years and where was he? And I know you write about the time, 14 years he was a public servant and in prison and all that. Go through those.
Well, he spent the first 29 years, exactly half of his life, doing not much of anything. He was a son of a sort of impoverished gentleman who didn't want to work. Had a small estate outside Florence, and he managed his small patrimony, managed to eke a small living, enough to allow him to lead a life of leisure. And Machiavelli originally followed very much in his father's footsteps as a kind of dilettante. He had a good humanist education, which meant he learned Latin. He learned to memorize and to read most of the great Latin writers, Cicero and Virgil and Seneca and Tacitus and Livy, of course. So he had a good education, but he really didn't accomplish very much till he was 29. And it was only then, with the fall of Savonarola, that he takes on a career in public service. And he does this for 14 years, during a period in which Florence had recovered its republican institutions. It had been dominated by the Medici family for decades, but in 1494, the Medici are expelled, and there's a 4-year interregnum where Savonarola, the great fire and brimstone preacher, is really running things in Florence. And then with Savonarola's execution in 1498, right after that, Machiavelli takes office, which suggests that he belonged to that party that was opposed to Savonarola. And for the next 14 years, he serves as what I like to think of, and I'm trying to find an equivalent in today's politics, a kind of undersecretary of state, roving diplomat, not a top member of the bureaucracy, but a fairly high official with fairly large responsibilities, which continue to grow as he shows himself to be a capable, energetic, and patriotic man. He does this for 14 years until the Medici return to Florence on the backs of Spanish lances. They've been trying for 14 years to get back into the city that had expelled them. They finally manage it after the Florentines back the wrong army. They back the French army. Spanish army is victorious. The Medici brothers, Giovanni de' Medici, who's a cardinal, and Giuliano, succeed in getting a bunch of mercenaries, Spanish mercenaries, to descend upon the city, topple the government of which Machiavelli is a part, and he is booted out of office unceremoniously. Following that, he's a couple of months later, he's actually imprisoned and tortured because his name crops up on a list of people in the pocket of somebody who's plotting to overthrow the Medici regime, a young man named Boscoli, who is trying to gather fellow conspirators, and Machiavelli's name was on the list. He was never approached by Boscoli, and if he had been, it's almost certain that Machiavelli would have, shut the door in his face. Machiavelli was not too big on conspiracies. He writes about that a couple of times, saying how dangerous they are and how often they fail. I mean, Machiavelli could often be a kind of political agitator, but he was not somebody who believed in kind of violent overthrow of legitimate government. He was very much a bureaucrat, and I think one of the things about Machiavelli is the first man who really speaks for the bureaucracy, the federal bureaucracy, the man who puts the values of the state, of government, over the people. And he really he's the first who sort of articulates that view. The French phrase is raison d'etat, or reason of state. And he's really the proponent of that kind of system.
When did he marry?
He married in 1501. He married a young woman from the neighboring quarter of Florence named Marietta Corsini, who was probably slightly above him socially. She was we don't know that much about her because women were not really considered worthy of, and Machiavelli didn't really consider her worthy of spending a lot of time and effort recording her sort of day-to-day life. Marriage in Florence was very much a kind of business arrangement, but she was from a suitable family. The Corsini family were more or less equal to the Machiavelli, perhaps a little better established, perhaps a little less down at the heels. So he was probably moving up a bit when he married her.
Children?
He had 6 children, 4 boys, 2 girls. He was a good family man to that extent. And their marriage was, I don't think, by our standards, not a conventional marriage. He was quite a philanderer. He liked visiting the whorehouses. He was serially unfaithful. His wife seemed to put up with this, partly because that was expected of a good wife. She was almost certainly considerably a decade or so younger than he was. This was typical of Florentine marriages, men married in their late 20s, women in their late teens. So the difference in age meant that he was probably a much more worldly and sophisticated man. And she was there. And one of the interesting things you have about her one of the few things we know about her is she complained often that he was never around. He was always going off on these trips to the court of France or the Cesare Borgia. And she complained that he wasn't absent, that he wasn't there for her, which suggests that when he was there, she enjoyed his company and they had a good family life. And they did produce 6 children, so they managed to spend a good deal of time together.
I have a question about where you find this stuff. I know it's not stuff, the material in the book. How do you know, 500 years later, that he visited a house of prostitute?
Because he wrote about it. And Machiavelli was not shy about exposing his own peccadillos. I think one of the great things about Machiavelli is his kind of humanity, his warmth, his ability to sort of see the ridiculousness in other people, but also in himself, which is why he was quite popular. There are many letters from his friends talking about his wonderful sense of humor, which was rather coarse. And he writes this kind of awful letter of an experience he had while he was away, in which he visited a prostitute in the dark, and he was sold. Some procuress came and said, I have this lovely young thing for you, paid 2 ducats and you can have her. And of course, it transpires that when he turns on the light, she's this old, toothless hag, and it's a terrible. But this is the kind of humor and sort of earthy stuff Machiavelli and his friends trafficked in. It was not a Victorian age by any means. It was very earthy, scurrilous things we probably can't say on TV. So we do know he reported on his various loves, his affairs, and his friends did as well. They often teased him, saying, if you come back to Florence, you're going to get in trouble for having engaged in unnatural sex acts. Much of it was humorous, but certainly he was no saint in his personal behavior.
Do you have any idea how many people there were in the world 500 years ago?
Oh, many fewer than today. I don't know. I don't know the answer.
Do you have any idea about around Florence and Milan and all those? How many people were there?
Florence was actually surprisingly small. If you if you think about Florence and how Florence looms in the kind of culture of the West and civilization, it's surprising that it was a city of less than 50,000 people at the time that Machiavelli lived there. I don't know what it compares to in terms of some very small, American, town, but it produced Brunelleschi and Da Vinci and Michelangelo, Donatello, Dante, Petrarch. I mean, if the list of geniuses in a population that small is incredibly impressive and almost inexplicable. But it was a very small town. It had been larger in the Middle Ages. It had been decimated by the Black Plague in the 14th century, and its population probably shrunk by half. So at its peak in the 14th century, it's probably a city of about 100,000.
So what would happen if the 538 people who have a seat over in the House and the Senate and the three that don't have voting but are representatives read your book and thought through what Machiavelli said back in those years and also read The Prince? I mean, what could they learn from it?
Well, I think despite his reputation, I think the greatest contribution Machiavelli has made to political thought is sort of is to look at things practically. He was the philosophers who came before him, those who wrote about politics before him, going back to Plato and Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, believed essentially that the world and politics and human society really advanced and was really based on something rational. For the Greeks, reason, both Aristotle and Plato thought that reason ruled the way the world worked and the way human societies worked. And he said that politics is the knowledge by which we make men good. That is not Machiavelli's philosophy. Machiavelli believed, and he says that many have written about societies that never were and never could be. I want to show you the way men really are. So I think in the broadest sense, he was the first to sort of look at men as they really are and to say, okay, men are selfish, they're ambitious, they're deceitful. How can we build a government based on this premise? And I think certainly the founding fathers had a very similar attitude towards politics, that men are basically ambitious, untrustworthy. No one has a monopoly on the truth. This is why we need to balance one group against another. This is why we have our checks and our balances. Madison famously said in one of the Federalist papers, I don't remember which, that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. And this is by that balancing of opposing interests is how we form a more perfect union. And I think this is something that really goes back to Machiavelli's notion of looking at men as they really are, as selfish men who sort of work for their own interests.
Did the people that wrote our Constitution read Machiavelli?
We know that John Adams did because he wrote about Machiavelli. The other ones, there is no or very little direct testimony, but we do know that they read people who read Machiavelli, particularly a group of English political philosophers known as the Commonwealth men. And the Commonwealth men came out of the English liberal tradition and were the sort of people like John Locke. There's a famous treatise that most of the founding fathers had in their libraries called Cato's Letters, which is a long passage about Machiavelli and why we should not regard Machiavelli as a philosopher of evil, as he had been believed, but a man who was showing us that men are selfish in order that we may guard against it, that we may build systems that can work with and sort of balance one interest off against the other. So indirectly, if not directly, we know that Machiavelli had an influence on the founding fathers and on the way our Constitution was framed.
I have a copy here of The Prince. Do you have any idea how many of these have been sold in 500 years?
No, I don't. It was I would say it was a bestseller shortly after his death, particularly after it was put on the index of prohibited books by the Pope. That helped things a lot.
Why did the Pope prohibit the book to being read by Catholics?
Well, in 1559 was the Counter-Reformation, was the reaction to and the response to Martin Luther and the Reformation, and the Church was trying to reform its ways and to combat the growing threat of Protestantism by reviving the Church and sort of fighting back. And one of the things I wanted to do was crack down on dissent to sort of come up with a unified line. And Machiavelli had written terrible things about the Church. He had pretty much raked them over the coals, particularly in the discourses, where he blames the Church for basically having destroyed Italy. He said the Church was too strong to allow a proper government to form in Italy, but not strong enough to unify it. They were continually inviting in foreigners to sort of save their bacon. They invited in the French or the Spanish or the Austrians whenever they were threatened, thereby sort of stirring the pot and making it impossible for Italy to develop a unified government. So Machiavelli was very tough on them.
Was he religious?
He was not religious. He paid lip service to religion, and many people have asked over the years whether Machiavelli was an atheist or not. My own sense is that Machiavelli really didn't care enough about religion to be an atheist. He didn't care for metaphysics. He was sort of outwardly conventional, though there are times when he says that, I didn't attend Mass. I don't attend Mass like I know you do, he wrote to one of his friends. He often made fun of religious people. He thought they were corrupt, as they were. If you know the Renaissance popes, they were, Rodrigo Borgia, who acknowledged his own children, Sixtus IV, who tried to have the ruler of Florence murdered. They were not a spiritual lot, I think is the nice
Was there somebody that was a pope at 13, or was that a cardinal at 13?
It was Giovanni de' Medici was a cardinal at 13. Lorenzo de' Medici's son, who later becomes Pope Leo X, was made a cardinal as a political favor to him. This is sort of the way things went. That was a little unusual even for that time, but that sort of it was very much, and it's not entirely the Church's fault. The Church was sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place because they were the spiritual leader of Christendom, but they were also a state. They were also a political entity that had to fight for its territories, fight for its life, just like every other territory. So they're sort of caught betwixt and between, trying to be the spiritual father to their flock and sort of acting like a Renaissance princeling.
How often do you run into people that have never read The Prince?
Most people have, I think, at one time or another in school or someplace. And you find it in sort of interesting places. I remember shortly after I started writing this book, my editor sent me a little clip about an article that apparently Lindsay Lohan was carrying a copy of The Prince around with her everywhere. I don't know what she did with it. I'm not sure she learned the proper lessons from it. But he has an appeal outside of the realm of politics that I think very few other political writers have. I think because he represents such a kind of personality type, the gadfly, the guy who's not going to put up with, any of the silly, funny business, who's going to sort of puncture the pieties and the assumptions. And in a way, anytime somebody sort of, talks about, how good people are basically good. There are people who believe that, but there's also the other type, the people who believe that people are basically scoundrels, and pretty much ought to check your pockets, to make sure they haven't been picked. I mean, that is Machiavelli. People who feel that way feel a kinship with Machiavelli. They relate to him on a sort of visceral level.
Where did you get your education?
Informally, I got my education largely in Florence for this. I went to Brandeis, and I was actually an art major. I wrote about art for many years before I sort of went back to my original love of history and Italian and Renaissance history in particular.
So how do you make your living?
As a writer.
No teaching?
I have taught before, and I used to be a journalist and an editor at a paper, but right now I earn my living writing.
Where were you a journalist?
I edited an art magazine called Art New England for many years. Covered the regional arts. I wrote for the New York Times for many years, and I've written for numerous other publications along the way. And I also taught some. It was not teaching was not my calling, but I prefer sort of sitting there in front of a computer.
By the way, what happened to Mom in all this? She's still alive?
No, she died some years ago. We eventually decided we couldn't financially manage to stay in Italy. It was a lark, as I said. It was a kind of spontaneous thing, and I don't think my father appreciated it that much. And he was paying child support to have his kids, 3,000 miles away. Was not ideal for him, and so we stayed there 4.5 years about, and then I finally came back to complete high school in the United States.
Where are your siblings?
One of them lives in New York, and the other actually lives in Germany right now. He writes for The Economist, and he sort of goes all over the world.
Either one of them as interested in all this as you are?
No, I think I'm the one that that sort of period stuck with the most. I was, even before I moved there, I was very interested in art, and sort of when you're in Florence and, sort of surrounded by Michelangelos and Donatellos and Leonardos, it's sort of, there's not many places better to be. But there are two writers in the family. My father's also a writer, an historian, and has written many books.
Where does he live now?
He lives He lives in New Jersey. He taught at NYU for many years, and an American historian. So I sort of came to history by a kind of roundabout way.
What's his first name?
Erwin.
Erwin Unger.
Unger, yeah.
Okay. Back to the Prince. You have a photograph in the book, a couple of them. Mm-hmm. I'd ask you, did you take those by any chance?
I took some of them.
The one I'm thinking of are where he wrote The Prince. The house.
The house, yes, I did.
Where is that?
It's in a little village called Sant'Andrea in Percusina, which is about 10 miles south of Florence, and I urge anybody who's going to Florence to visit it. Not so much for Machiavelli's house, but you can see it's a lovely countryside. Machiavelli wasn't too happy there, felt he was exiled there, but that's Machiavelli's house. Very much the way it was when he lived there. If you have the concierge open up the house, and it's funny because Italians have so much history around them. It's not like going to Mount Vernon or something where there's a big deal made of it. You have to go across the street, find somebody who'll open the door for you, and they'll show you around and say, oh, here's the desk where he wrote The Prince. But it's still very much, and the village is still very much the way it was in Machiavelli's day.
How much time did you spend there?
This time when I photographed, I just spent a day there. There's not many amenities or things to do. I took a day trip, a beautiful day trip out of Florence and sort of roaming. I remember we walked around the olive fields, the vineyards. It's still very much, you sort of can feel you're back in the 15th or 16th century. It's to see the world through Machiavelli's eyes, what he considered his place of exile. He only spent time there, large chunks of time there after he lost his job, and he felt very much. You can actually see Florence from the Brunelleschi's dome. You can still see, and the tower of the palace where he worked as the second chancellor of Florence. You can see, and he must have sat there and pined, And he talks about this, and he sort of feels he would do anything to get back into Florence, to get back to work. He was not one of these people who loved the countryside.
So how old was he after his 14 years of working for the government, how old was he when he lost his job?
He was about 45.
And then how old was he when he wrote The Prince?
He wrote it very quickly thereafter because he was a man, as he said, who was not suited to sort of puttering around his farm, tilling the soil, clipping the vines. That was not him. He was very much a political animal, and as soon as he lost his job, as soon as he got out of prison and recovered from the physical ordeal of the torture he had undergone, he was very anxious to get back into the good graces of the people who now ran the government. The Medici were back in power, and so if he wanted to get back, have any position in government, he needed to ingratiate himself with the Medici.
Well, in The Prince, he writes a letter to Lorenzo de' Medici up front, and he says this, I realized this is in his letter, I realized there was nothing more precious or important to me than my knowledge of great men and their doings. Mm-hmm. Was he playing up to him?
Partly, though he did this less well than most flatterers. Machiavelli, despite the name, was very un-Machiavellian. He was constantly advising princes to be deceitful, to do anything they could to be underhanded, but he in his own life was rather too frank for his own good. He tended to tell people sort of unpleasant truths they didn't really want to hear. And in the case of The Prince, which was in effect a job application to get back, he gave this to, originally wrote it for Giuliano de' Medici, then Giuliano de' Medici dies, and Lorenzo, his nephew, takes over. So the final dedication goes to Lorenzo de' Medici, and he presents it to him as a job application. He says, here is the fruit of, I can't give you expensive gifts, I can't give you poetry, but what I can give you is the wisdom accrued over 14 years of service to the government. And Lorenzo didn't want to hear anything about it.
What is your original manuscript anywhere?
No. It was not published in its own day, in fact. As far as I know, there are no extant copies of a written manuscript. But it circulated in manuscript in its own day, and then a few years after he died, it was published. But it was quite well known in sort of intellectual circles in Florence during his lifetime, and it made him actually quite notorious among the Florentine intelligentsia.
Here's something out of chapter 15, and I just pulled. It's a small book.
Yes, it is. That's one of the reasons it's so popular. It's an easy read, a fun read.
This is in the middle of chapter 15. What men and particularly rulers, and this particular translator uses rulers for the word prince all throughout. He says, if you always want to play the good man in a world where most people are not good, this is what Machiavelli is saying, you'll end up badly. Hence, if a ruler wants to survive, he'll have to learn to stop being good, at least when the occasion demands.
That is a classic formulation of Machiavelli. Again, was made the rather reasonable assumption that no ruler can do anything unless he's in power, and no ruler who always follows the path of virtue will remain in power long. But he did say that the best thing for a ruler to do would not necessarily to always be virtuous, but to appear virtuous. That is the key. Appearing virtuous can often be useful. Being virtuous rarely is.
Actually, the next chapter. Hence, if you're determined to have people think of you as generous, you'll have to be lavish in every possible way. Naturally, a ruler who follows this policy will soon use up all his wealth to the point that if he wants to keep up his reputation, he'll have to impose special taxes and do everything a ruler can to raise cash. His people will start to hate him, and no one will respect him. Now he has no money.
Mm-hmm. I think it's very applicable to today's situation.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you.
Yeah, and it's, in order to ingratiate yourself with the people, you have to constantly spend on them, give them what they want, don't raise their taxes, and of course then you eventually run out of money and you're stuck with a situation where you sort of the fix we're in now, where we have to sort of get revenue somewhere or stop spending, neither of which is palatable to a people that's constantly been told they can have everything.
Do you have any idea in those days there was no electricity?
No electricity.
There were no cell phones. There were no ways to play music except live. And in that house, do you have any idea when he was in that house how he wrote? What did they use in those days?
Used a quill pen, ink, and parchment or paper, probably paper for Machiavelli, since parchment was expensive, and he was not, particularly after he lost his job, was not rich, was constantly complaining about money. So he wrote with a quill pen on paper, and this was the early days of printing, sort of the birth of printing in Italy, right around the same time Machiavelli was writing. And a couple of pieces were actually published. The only book that was published in his lifetime was The Art of War. The other ones circulated in manuscript. But there would be copyists. If a work were popular and people wanted to read it, there would be professional copyists who'd make...
Are there first editions of The Prince anywhere?
I don't know that what the earliest edition. I would imagine there are from the 1530s. I'm not an incunabulist and don't know the market, but I'd love to have one.
But see if we can get you one. We'll put a time frame on it again. He left the government when he was around 45, and he died when he was 58.
Right.
And he wrote it right in the 45, 56, or 46.
He wrote it very quickly. There's a letter from December 10th, 1513. He wrote to his friend Francesco Vettori, who was ambassador to Rome at the time, and he said, "I've written this little pamphlet of mine, and I'm hoping that the Medici will read it and allow I think he put it, allow me to at least roll stones for them, an expression meaning at least put me to some useful work." So he had written it very quickly, but he was out of prison in February 1513. By December, he claimed he had pretty much finished it and was ready to send it off. So it was a quick work. He dashed off in the sort of heat of the moment. And as you point out, it's quite a short book. So,
how long had he been in prison?
He was in prison for about 3 weeks, which wouldn't have been so terrible. I mean, the conditions were not good, but the worst thing about it was that he was constantly threatened with being executed. A couple of the people who were implicated in the same plot he were beheaded sort of right outside his window, which must have been a very unnerving experience for him. And he was also tortured. The Florentines' favored form of torture was something called the strappado, where they take your arms and they bind it behind your back and put you on a platform, then pull the platform out and basically dislocate your shoulders and rip your muscle. And it's not a pleasant thing. The same torture had been applied to Savonarola before his execution, and Savonarola broke very quickly and confessed to everything, confessed to all the crimes they wanted him to. Machiavelli seemed to be made of sterner stuff, though perhaps it was because he really didn't have much to confess. He was innocent, but he was rather proud of himself for how he came out of that. Saying he thought of himself a better man than he had before for having endured this like such a man.
Here's chapter 18. Pope Alexander VI never did anything but con people. That was all he ever thought about. And he always found people who he could con. No one ever gave more convincing promises than Alexander or swore greater oaths to back them up, and no one ever kept his promises less. Yet his deceptions always worked because he knew this side of human nature so well.
I think it's the sort of definition of grudging respect. He had a grudging respect for Pope Alexander, who's the same as Rodrigo Borgia, the infamous scion of the Borgia family. And this is one of Machiavelli's, the points he makes throughout, and one of the things that's given him a reputation for such wickedness. And I think even more than Machiavelli's defense of violence, it's his defense of lying that has gotten him into such trouble over the years. But he's makes the point that Alexander, by lying, managed to succeed where others more honest failed. Which would you rather have? A man and a ruler's job is to succeed, and Alexander succeeded. Though he would, I think, with the case of Alexander, he also chastises him because he says that his lies and his success were meant only for his own family. And he contrasts this with Julius II, his Alexander's successor, who was equally duplicitous and equally violent, but his lies and his violence were for the sake of the church, for the sake of something larger than pure nepotism. And so I think it's fair to say that Machiavelli's attitude towards Alexander was grudging with respect, with perhaps the emphasis on the grudging.
How many of those popes back then were married?
None were married. Many had children. Few acknowledged their children. One of the things about Rodrigo Borgia, Alexander VI, was that he openly acknowledged his own children. Usually popes would pass off their children as nephews.
Did he have children while he was pope?
No, most of them were. He was an older man by then, but they were children when he was cardinal. Certainly, he was very open about his mistresses. He had his favorite mistresses. There are stories of orgies in the Vatican, which he and his son participated in. Murders in the Vatican. It was sort of like Rome under Nero, pretty much sort of bacchanalian place, and of course his most infamous child was Cesare Borgia, and also there's the famously beautiful and mysterious Lucrezia Borgia as well.
You say that Cesare, his son, had syphilis?
Yeah, it was going around. It had been brought in. People speculated come over with Columbus's ships in 1492 and eventually spread. And when the French armies invaded in 1494, the Italians assumed they brought it with them. And I don't know if that was fair, but it certainly seemed to coincide with the French invasion. A year or two after, syphilis becomes a serious problem in Italy and around the rest of Europe. And the Italians called it the French pox.
You say that Rodrigo Borgia, who was Pope Alexander VI, born in Spain, that he committed the deadly sins of greed, wrath, lust, gluttony, and pride?
At least those many, yes. He was, and he was not, as I said, I think one of the refreshing things about Rodrigo Borgia is even though many of his predecessors and successors were equally corrupt, he sort of reveled in his corruption. He didn't care who knew it. He felt confident enough in himself and his power that he could get away with this. And given the track record of people like Sixtus IV, who sort of went around murdering people, murdering his political enemies, it was pretty safe for him to assume that he could get away with it. Even when Savonarola started railing against him from the pulpit in Florence, he pretty much put up with the insults as long as he was politically on board. He didn't mind being called a lustful, greedy, corrupt man. He said, yeah, pretty much I am.
Put Savonarola in context again. I remember I wrote down a quote when I was reading your book. I believe Christ speaks through my mouth was his quote. And then you give the impression, or maybe it's not impression, but it's truth, that he was kind of an evangelist type?
He was a fundamentalist. Some have described him as a religious fanatic. He was a religious visionary, and I think he's an interesting character because he had some very scary attributes and some very admirable attributes.
What was he? Who was he?
He was a Dominican friar who came to Florence in 1492 from Ferrara. So he was a foreigner, which always made him a bit suspicious to Florentines. But he quickly gained a reputation as a kind of fire and brimstone preacher, calling on Florentines to reform their ways, saying, the judgment is at hand, fire and pestilence and flood will come. And he got a very good response because I think Florentines felt a little guilty about their sort of sybaritic lifestyle, the corruption. He also, and I think that this is the most admirable aspect of him, he was very much an advocate for the poor and oppressed, and he gained a following among the poor, the disenfranchised workers, the urban proletariat. And so he was very much a Democrat. He was responsible for restoring the democratic institutions of Florence after the Medici expulsion. But he was also dangerously convinced, I think, that, as you say, God spoke through him. He kept talking about his own martyrdom. He might have been emotionally unstable. So he really put, through the 4 years that he, in effect, ruled Florence, he put them through the ringer. It was many people thought, the rapture, the sort of second coming was about to come, and people had to reform their ways. He had built these huge bonfires of the vanities in the central square of Florence, where Botticelli would throw his paintings, and jewels would be thrown, and brocaded dresses. So all the sort of great cultural wealth of Florence ended up being consumed in these huge bonfires. And it was very much a reaction to the kind of corruption and sort of luxury of Florence.
But did I read in the book that he really didn't believe this stuff?
Well, when he was tortured, he claimed he was made to confess that he didn't believe it, but then he recanted that original confession. I think he did believe it. It's always difficult to tell with people like Savonarola where personal ambition and genuine belief separate. I think he was both. I think he was very ambitious, but his ambition, as he saw it, was for Christ, for a better world. And I think we see this in sort of contemporary figures who mix sort of religious, visionary qualities with sort of messianic belief in themselves with sort of politics. It's very hard to know where belief ends and sort of pure personal ambition begins.
Go back to this book that you wrote. Contrast where you wrote it with where Machiavelli wrote The Prince. What were the circumstances for you? Where did you do it?
Well, I did a lot of research in Italy, in Florence, and when I say research, I mean I spent a lot of time at restaurants and having a good time, and doing some research as well, and sort of getting a feel for the place. And I think that's I always like to go back. Every book I write about Florence, I take at least one trip to drink in the atmosphere and the Chianti, most of the circumstances are not quite as romantic. I spend a lot of time, I think, like most writers, in front of a computer screen. And fortunately for something like this, there's a lot of material available. Machiavelli's letters, which are a wonderful read, either in the original Italian or even in English translation. They're just very lively, full of wonderful incident and colorful tales. And he's quite a storyteller himself.
Are they online?
I haven't found them online.
But where do you go to get them?
Well, there are Italian editions of his complete letters, which I read, and I believe there's also an English version. I think it's something called Machiavelli and His Friends.
Are you fluent in Italian?
Yeah, my speaking is a bit rusty, but my reading is still pretty good. Though 15th century, 16th century Tuscan is a little different from modern Italian. But
how did this is a Simon & Schuster book, big publisher,
yep.
A name from 500 years ago. Whose idea was it, yours or theirs?
Well, it was originally my idea. It was shaped as we went along, as most of these projects are. We had talked about maybe doing a book on Savonarola and Machiavelli, who are sort of, I think it's interesting that two people who represent almost diametrically opposed visions of the world sort of were in the same place at the same time. And one of the early chapters of the book, I sort of talk about that point at which Machiavelli is in the crowd while Savonarola is preaching one of his, hellfire sermons, and Machiavelli is commenting on it. He was sent there to write a report back what Machiavelli was saying to the ambassador in Rome, and but it's just the idea of those two people sort of being in there and sort of having completely opposite views of what made the world tick, what the world was about. I thought it was such a fascinating thing, but it ended up being sort of pared down a bit to Machiavelli. But we were both interested in this period of Florentine history. It's an endlessly fascinating period.
Do you have any idea how many copies of this book that the publisher thinks will sell?
I don't. I'm not sure. I actually have to say I do not know how many they ran off, but
I mean,
I try to stay away from the sort of marketing end of things.
But what's the audience from their perspective? Is this one for colleges?
It can be for colleges. It's also for people who like biography, who liked rousing tales of interesting figures from different periods. I mean, the people read biographies of Cleopatra. There's an endless hunger for biographies of the founding fathers. I think he's one of the seminal figures of sort of Western thought, and he's just a very interesting guy and a very entertaining guy to be around. And I certainly enjoyed spending a couple of years with him, and I hope people reading the book have a...
Here's a sentence from your book near the end, under the headline "Finger of Satan." To describe someone as a Marxist is to define his political views. To describe someone as Machiavellian is to impugn his character. Machiavelli was certainly not the world's first cynic, but he has been so closely identified with a certain kind of unscrupulousness that any manipulative, self-serving behavior is now described as Machiavellian. How cynical was he?
He had a rather skeptical view of human nature, I think you can say. He believed people were basically selfish, weak, fearful, pursued their own advantage, but he also had a very humane view of the human race. I think he was a very warm, and I think it certainly comes through in his comedies. He had a very warm understanding of human nature. He said men are scoundrels in some sense, but he also said we're just basically animals pursuing our own sort of basic needs, and he was accepting of human nature. And I think that's one of the things that made him different from other people who had a rather bleak view of human nature, like St. Augustine, for instance, who talks about how human beings is essentially wicked. Machiavelli, when he said they were wicked, is much more accepting. He says, it is impossible to go against what nature compels you to do. In a way, he's sort of an early Darwinist, saying we're basically animals competing for resources, competing for power, and it is what is unnatural is to expect people not to live like this. So he had a very sort of on the one hand, is skeptical of human nature, but also sympathetic with it.
You write this too. He took pleasure in scandalizing his readers, standing traditional nostrums on their head and demonstrating how following the recommendations of conventional moralists could lead to disaster. What do you think his reaction would be if he came back today, 500 years later, and he saw that his book was everywhere?
I think he'd get a kick out of it. He was very ambitious. He was not modest. He was not falsely modest. He was very... I think one of the things that drove him was a sense of his own sort of marginality in Florentine society. He's always had to work at the behest of some rich, stupid man that he had to court, like Lorenzo de' Medici or Giuliano de' Medici, and I think it irritated him that they treated him with such disdain. And I think he would have gotten quite a kick out of the fact that who remembers, at least not Lorenzo the Magnificent, many people remember him, but the Lorenzo to whom he dedicated the book. Nobody remembers him except for the fact that Machiavelli dedicated The Prince to him, and the fact that Michelangelo built a wonderful tomb in his honor.
Did he ever get a job after he was run out of government?
He got a job, not quite a job, but he was sent on missions after a number of years of sort of being in the political wilderness. He got a number of assignments from Giulio de' Medici, who was a more sort of sympathetic figure. Cardinal Giulio de' Medici eventually becomes Pope Clement VII, and they're both fellow intellectuals. There's a kind of mutual admiration, and he gets some kind of small assignments late in life. He sort of gets back in the saddle again, fighting for Florentine independence in a very difficult time. So he never really got a steady job back, but he sort of late in life he did manage to feel at least he was contributing something to his country, and he was an ardent patriot, and that was very important to him.
Here's more from The Prince. In this regard, it's worth noting that you can be hated just as much for the good you do as the bad, which is why, as I said before, a ruler, or a prince, who wants to stay in power is often forced not to be good, because when a powerful group whether they be the common people, the army, or the nobility, is corrupt, then if you reckon you need their support, you'll have to play to their mood, keep them happy, and at that point, any good you do will only put you at risk. Again, what would he think about if he came to this country today and looked at what was going on?
I think he would see there's a lot of pandering going on. I think he lived in a less squeamish age. I don't think that, the most hard-headed politician today would, imprison and behead his political opponents. I don't think that's something that's going to happen. I think Machiavelli would look at our political system and he would see that there are a lot of people who are afraid to tell the truth, who are afraid to do the hard work necessary to get things done. I think he's not a big fan of pandering. He wrote a scathing indictment of those who, during a period of war when Florence was trying to reconquer the little republic of Pisa that had escaped its grasp, and people were refusing to pay their taxes to fund the war. He wrote a scathing indictment of this, saying, how can you who claim to want to be free but will do nothing to, bring that about? I think he probably would have been very harsh on the lack of civic mindedness that he would find, I think, in contemporary American politics.
Do you think you'd like him?
I think I would. I do like him. I think he's...
I mean, personally, from what you know of him.
I think, yeah. I mean, it was a coarser age, and there's a kind of level of kind of coarse humor and ribaldry and, sort of disreputable living that I think I would have a hard time as a married man sort of accepting
You have kids?
life. I have kids,
How
yeah.
many?
2. I have 2 daughters, and I would keep him far away from my daughters. He was a bit of a lech, but I think he's a very warm, witty guy. He's tactless and acerbic, but he was very well loved by his friends. He also had a lot of enemies, particularly those who were his political superiors.
This cover you have, is that the only likeness we have of Machiavelli?
There were a couple of others. There are no likenesses of him from life. This was done a few years after his death, based on descriptions of people who knew him. But it's probably, if most of them agree fairly closely. And there are some descriptions of him. His wife wrote a letter to him, the only letter we have from her hand when he was away in Rome, describing the birth of their young son, saying his jet black hair, just like you. And so there are a couple of descriptions that we have of him. And that's, I think, the best of them and the most convincing.
What's your next book?
Have a couple of ideas. I'm thinking about doing something again in the Italian Renaissance, which I love, or branching out to something else, and I haven't entirely decided. I wouldn't mind doing this, mining this territory as long as possible. There are many great characters and figures from the age that are...
You got to go back to Florence and try some of that Chianti. Or
yes, no, that's another reason to mine this particular territory. The perks are nice.
Our guest has been Miles J. Unger. He is the author of Machiavelli, a biography, and we thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
For a DVD copy of this program, call 1-877-662-7726. For free transcripts or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qna.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.